Mutiny? What mutiny? Apathy and relief are having a field day in Moscow this morning. The regime hopes that amnesia will follow soon, and that the obedient citizens of the city and beyond will have forgotten that Russia was on the verge of civil war just days ago, and that no one tries too hard to really understand what went down behind the walls of this forbidden city, otherwise known as the Kremlin, and that it was all a fever dream. But was it?
Mama! Mama! Mama!
The oil refinery blown up south of Moscow was all too real. So was the show and tell of Wagner Mercenaries in the city of Rostov-on-Don. And so is Putin, livid and standing for once off-centre, vowing to squash the mutiny. That was Saturday. This was today. Putin back at a desk, sitting down in reassuring blandness, addressing young engineers about business prospects. Not a word about Saturday. Also enlisted today in Operation Pretend Everything is Normal, a government meeting where the faces say it all. But these players need more lessons in normality. They look terrified of a purge, of another rebellion, of the unknown. Top of the table, Russia's obscure prime minister, trying out a familiar line. Saturday was all the West's evil doing.
Russia is going through an important time in its history. As the president noted, virtually the entire military, economic, information machine of the West is directed against us. In essence, we are now battling for the right to choose our own path.
But this was a nightmare of Russia's own making, and its name is Yevgeny Priogozhin. The foul-mouthed commander-in-chief of the Wagner private army, the Frankenstein monster that Putin first created and then was forced to buy off on Saturday after he threatened to march on Moscow and was cheered like a hero by the citizens of Rostov-on-Don. The former pastry chef whose power rose like a souffle, who was astonishingly allowed to build up a private army. Today, from an undisclosed location, he suddenly resurfaced, a voice from exile. In an 11-minute audio statement, he defended the uprising, saying society demanded it, but also that he wasn't intending to take down Putin.
The goal of our march was to prevent the destruction of Wagner and bring those who made a huge number of mistakes during the special military operation to justice. We marched to express our protest, not to oust our country's government.
Prigozhin presided over the Battle of Bakhmut, perhaps the only thing that Russia could call a victory this year. The real significance of this wasteland, apart from the appalling loss of life, is that it gave Prigozhin license to take on the incompetent top brass in Russia, a license earned in blood to demand the removal of the senior general Valery Gerasimov and the defense minister Sergei Shoigu. And this is where Putin has a problem, because Putin and Shoigu go back a long way. They were trout fishing buddies in the good old days. Shoigu has been defense minister for 11 years, and he was determined to muzzle Prigozhin and incorporate his Wagner troops in the army's ranks. It looks today as if Shoigu has not been sacrificed and that his loyalty has been rewarded, hence his appearance on tape in mute and not in disgrace. Russian politics has become a bloody game of competing loyalties in a landscape of power and patronage where loyalty matters more than competence. And so to the other dismal new normal, the war in Ukraine. The defense ministry in Moscow announcing today more missile strikes. The war has been Putin's biggest gamble so far, and if he ends up losing power, it's because he would have lost that gamble. Well, the march on Moscow was as dramatic as it was sudden. On Saturday morning, Wagner forces crossed from Ukraine into Russia and soon entered Rostov-on-Don. After claiming that he had control of the southern city, Prigozhin was seen meeting with military top brass and telling them that he'd march onto Moscow. A state of emergency was declared, and ashen-faced Putin took to the airwaves, vowing to crush what he called an armed mutiny, accusing Prigozhin of treason and a stab in the back. But Wagner forces were undeterred. They moved north with military convoys seen passing the city of Voronezh, battling Russian Air Force helicopters along the M4 highway. 6 are thought to have been shot down, with more than a dozen airmen killed. On Saturday evening, with Russian forces preparing a last-ditch defence of the capital, and the mercenaries just 120 miles down the road, Prigozhin ordered his men to stand down, following frantic negotiations with President Lukashenko of Belarus.
Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, was following events closely as they developed over the weekend. She joins us now from Lviv. Lindsay, what do you make of Prigozhin's statement earlier today?
Well, first of all, we have no idea where it was issued from, where he is. Secondly, he didn't sound like a man defeated, did he? He didn't even sound penitent. And one of the important points he made was he said that his men in the Wagner group would not be signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Now, that was one of the main arguments that started all of this problem last month. He said they wouldn't sign contracts. Wagner fighters are paid more on the whole than ordinary soldiers. They're paid in cash, and so they don't have to pay tax, and they don't want to do those contracts. Now, at the same time as that, posters for Wagner, you know, all over Russia, which were torn down at the weekend, posters saying, you know, come and join this wonderful group, go to Ukraine. Those posters were going back up today. And also there were reports of camps for Wagner fighters being built in Belarus, north of Ukraine. So it looks as if, not that he's been he's been defeated, but that there is a shift of the Wagner group possibly to Belarus. And Belarus, of course, is just a wholly owned subsidiary of Russia. And President Lukashenko, he does everything that President Putin tells him.
So what do the Ukrainians make of it all?
Well, one of the things that's really interesting today, you saw that Putin today so stiff in that pre-recorded message talking about industrial production. By contrast, President Zelensky was out in Donetsk, one of the most dangerous parts of Ukraine today, and he was posing for selfies at petrol stations. Petrol stations are a big thing here in Ukraine because it's such a vast country, and they sell everything from garden implements to hot dogs. The hot dogs are very famous. And there he was with the people and the hot dogs. When did you ever see President Putin like that, actually talking to people? Because President Putin is so isolated, and yet Zelensky he's cultivated this sort of semi-military figure where he talks to people all the time. And the Ukrainians are making advances on the battlefield. This is all, at the moment, to Ukraine's advantage.
Lindsay, thanks very much. Well, Yevgeny Priogozhin took advantage of first Yeltsin's and then Putin's Russia to rise from a St. Petersburg gangster to a Kremlin caterer and now one of Russia's preeminent warlords. Vladimir Putin has often skillfully played off competing factions to ensure that he has stayed on top of the pile for 2 decades. But could his divide and rule strategy be his undoing, with the monsters he created now turning against him? Kieran Moodley reports.
2 Russian strongmen, weakened by the weekend, but where next for both? When Vladimir Putin presents himself among his people, it's stage-managed statecraft. When the Wagner Group's Yevgeny Priogozhin emerges, he's mobbed like a celebrity. But did he ever really have a chance of bringing down the president that made him?
The monster that Putin created with the Wagner, the monster is biting him now. The monster is acting against his creator.
The Wagner monster first rose in Ukraine in 2014, a group of private mercenaries recruited from the Russian military. Wagner's mission was for Russia to covertly exert control, a band of brothers working for Mother Russia, but arguing Father Putin had never sent them.
This is the recipe which they used in Crimea in 2014. So basically have a shadow army where they're not responsible for, can deny anything that is happening. And that's exactly what they used ever since.
And why does Putin want that deniability?
Well, he wanted to get away with it, with murder, literally. And he did.
Wagner was soon deployed elsewhere to support Bashar al-Assad in Syria. as well as across Africa from Mali to Burkina Faso. Russia today said they would not be withdrawn from the continent, claiming they're there to help battle against insurgents. The West takes a different view.
They threaten stability, they undermine good governance, they rob countries of mineral wealth, they violate human rights.
As Putin gained influence abroad, he also created the influential Yevgeny Priogozhin, a criminal turned caterer who, having been Putin's chef, gave him food for thought about the opportunities of a private Russian militia. But why did the paranoid, power-hungry Putin allow Prigozhin to become a man who could criticize the whole system?
He expects that they will do his bidding, except the trouble is when you rely on non-state actors, they end up having their agenda, they end up having their own interests, and they very often become hard to control. So this is certainly not by design.
The cracks in the bromance began in Bakhmut. As the Russian army struggled, Wagner piled its forces into that battle. Yet as Prigozhin's power grew, so did his voice, using social media to criticize the very premise of the war.
The defense ministry deceives the public. They tell a story that there was crazy aggression from the Ukrainian side, and they were going to attack us along with NATO's help. Actually, the so-called special operation of last February was started for other reasons.
Putin managed to simmer down his former chef with a reported deal that now sees Prigozhin in Belarusian exile. But the damage has been done. Wagner exposed the corruption at the heart of the Russian state.
It's almost sort of poetical in the sense that Wagner was created to mask the reality of what's going on, and now Wagner is there to actually uncover the reality of underneath, which is it's a corrupt system.
Exactly. It's like a turf war among mafia bosses. Of course, one of the key issues in any kind of mafia situation is to keep the peace. You don't want anybody to rock the boat. And that was Prigozhin's mistake now. He rocked the boat. And that got the whole thing unsettled. And this is where we are now. And this is where the situation at the moment, while we are sitting here, while the news are going on somewhere else, is actually very volatile. Because we don't know whose loyalty falls where.
As Wagner forces retreated from Rostov this weekend, the people cheered and waved them on. Prigozhin today said this was just about criticizing the wall, not the Kremlin. But that's the point. In questioning the wall, you question the state itself. And after this weekend, the state doesn't seem as strong as it once was.
Kieran Woodley on Wagner, not the composer. Well, I'm joined now by Mikhail Kazyanov, who served as Prime Minister of Russia under Vladimir Putin from 2000 to 2004. Welcome back on the program, Mr. Kazyanov. What do you think actually happened on Saturday afternoon? What do you think the deal was that called off this rebellion?
Oh, thank you for having a program. First of all, just the reason for Mr. Prigozhin's demonstration, as he described today, or as Mr. Putin said mutiny, was very simple. It's not evident, but simple. He wanted money. He wanted first the independent status. Being an illegal organization under existing Russian law, it is prohibited to have a military independent organization, and that's what he wanted recognition. He demanded so that the special piece of legislation to be adopted to legalize him. Secondly, he didn't want to be part of military defense or any other state agencies. He wanted to be independent. And thirdly, he wanted supplies of ammunition and money. And Mr. Shoigu and other generals, they didn't want to have him as a partner. And that's why their fight lasted for a few months. Mr. Prigozhin he's the man of Mr. Putin. That's the only, as in Russia we say, roof on top. Mr. Putin, the only person. All others hate Mr. Prigozhin. And Mr. Prigozhin played this game for many months, and he overplayed. He started praising Mr. Putin. He didn't want to change the regime. He didn't want to change the president. He wanted Mr. Putin to press Mr. Shoigu and other generals to implement Prigozhin's requirements. And Mr. Putin didn't do this. That's why he came to such an end. That is overplaying, and I think Mr. Prigozhin is in a big danger.
He's in big danger. What about Vladimir Putin? Is he in big danger?
Mr. Putin, of course, Mr. Prigozhin won this battle. He's in danger, but he won this battle. But the whole world and all Russians now just see Mr. Putin not a strong leader anymore. He's like a fanatic, but not strong leader. And just all his so-called stability, which he was proud for 23 years and the basis for existence of this regime, this stability questioned yesterday. Seriously questioned. Just there is no stability, and especially for those people who in so-called ruling elites. These people now understand that Mr. Putin is not a moderator and not defender of their interests anymore.
Right.
He is not a strong leader.
Okay.
He is a weak.
But if this is, Mr. Putin severely weakened, if this is the beginning of his end, what does that actually look like? Who will step in? What will step in to finally remove him from power?
No, it will not happen tomorrow. Will not happen in 2 weeks or 2 months. But the beginning of the end started. I thought before that it would be a very good, successful, I would say, operation of result of Ukrainian counteroffensive. And now we see Mr. Prigozhin appeared to be ahead of Ukrainians. He started this process. And then just expected Ukrainian I would say, success would cultivate these problems for Mr. Putin. The process for him started. We should already have started counting, just not literally days, but counting his time and power.
Okay, and is this moment of transition, which, as you say, has just begun, however long it takes, is that a moment of increased peril, not just for Ukraine, but also the rest of Europe and NATO?
Mr. Putin just pretended to be shown as that nothing happened, nothing serious happening, everything is under control, etc. They present the yesterday's deal as a compromise, good compromise. But what got good compromise? Just no single state institution was involved in this. That was a transaction between two gangsters. And people understand that there was no involvement of any agencies, and FSB was instructed to stop prosecution against Prigozhin. For outside world, we should expect that Mr. Putin tries to consolidate further on people around him, just to stand strong on the defending Ukrainian counteroffensive. But that situation already is being changed, and it is already weakening. Already we'll see just very soon.
Okay, Mikhail Kazyanov, thank you very much indeed. Well, a short while ago here on the balcony, I spoke to Igor Zhokva, who's the deputy head of the president's office, the president here in Ukraine, that is, of course. I began by asking him if Saturday's chaos was an opportunity to divert Russia's fire away from Ukraine onto itself.
This is a chance for the Russians, for the Russian ordinary people to see how weak is their system. Is there, when they claim that they're having the second strongest army in the world, or they're having the second strongest, or the most strongest state in the world, look what was happening. I mean, absolutely absence of any strong reaction when these things were happening. For us, very important what is going on the battlefield and how these events in Russia would influence to the development in the battlefield, because we are not stopping, we are moving on. We will be having this slowly but gradually. We'll be liberating our territories further on. I wonder what will be the morale of Russian armed forces after these events. I wonder what will be the morale of these Wagner guys who were present at the territory of Ukraine. So this is very important, and this is where the world has to pay attention at.
And has it given you opportunities on the front line that you didn't have last week?
I will certainly not comment you on the events which are going on the front line. Sorry for this, but really, we are taking every opportunity to near the victory, and that's what we'll be doing further on.
There are some reports from your chief of intelligence saying the next move that the Russians have planned is to mine the cooling pods at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, one of the biggest in Europe, and that if they decide to do so, they could blow the whole thing up and we would have a nuclear disaster. Is that a realistic assessment?
Well, unfortunately, the world underreacted to the events which were happening in the Novakhovka power plant. The dam. And it happened. I mean, who could imagine this before, that they will blow up the dam, that's terrorist attack, pre-planned terrorist attack, because they captured this station immediately from the first day of the open occupation. We were warning the international community. My president was warning half a year ago, and it happened. And it flooded the territory of South Ukraine. So let's be on the
alert.
That
was the Russians who blew that dam up. It wasn't, because there's some reports it might have been the Ukrainians.
Definitely. And I think your intelligence services have enough information on this. As far as Zaporizhzhia is concerned, we should be on alert. The biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, 6 nuclear units. We should not repeat the mistakes. Let's put it like this.
But why would the Russians blow up a nuclear power plant? They would also, if the wind heads the opposite direction, would impact on them?
Very logical question, but you probably will not get a logical answer from Russia. Why they are blackmailing us with a nuclear weapon? Because if you use nuclear weapon, probably the wind can go also to their direction. But they are blackmailing, threatening of us using this nuclear power plant. They are placing the tactical nuclear weaponry in Belarus next to them.
You're one of the key people in charge of the diplomacy around this war, the diplomacy for your President Zelensky. You've just come back from Denmark, where you were wooing the so-called global south. These are countries that have really sided with Russia or stayed on the fence. Are you making any progress in persuading them to come to your side?
Definitely. You know, this was a coincidence, or maybe not a coincidence. I mean, when all the world was falling, whether Prigozhin goes to not, Moscow, we were sitting together, National Security Advisor of Ukraine, all G7 countries, and global south countries like India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. Turkey was also included, and discussing on the level of National Security Advisor how to bring peace to Ukraine, but not on the Russian conditions, on the conditions of implementing Ukraine's peace formula and holding the peace summit.
You were discussing, but did you persuade them?
Yes. They are no longer talking about immediate ceasefire. They are no longer having any doubts who is aggressor. They are no longer...
I haven't seen their statements yet.
Please, sometimes you need quietness in this. I know you journalists want to have immediate news. We decided to meet in the near future for the next time in order to prolong this dialogue. In the end, there should happen a peace conference, Ukraine peace conference, discussing the Ukrainian peace formula and how to bring peace to my country. But, right, you are very important for global South countries to be there. They are talking now with Ukrainian representatives, not with Russian representatives, and I think this is a global shift.
Igor Zhokra, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, that was just a few minutes ago. We were talking, of course, throughout the program about the Wagner group of mercenaries, an army, a private army, if you like, of 50,000 men at the height of their power, now somewhat dwindled because of the fighting in Bakhmut. But I also caught up with the journalist and author Anne Applebaum, and I asked her what she read into Mr. Prigozhin's statement, his defiant statement earlier today.
It tells you that his sense or his intuition that he has some popular support is still there. And of course, he might be right. You know, one of the oddities of the events of Saturday was the fact that when he got to Rostov, nobody stopped him. He walked into the headquarters of the Southern Military District, had himself filmed talking to the generals. Outside on the street, the general public was talking to his men, taking selfies with them, bringing them food. When they finally pulled out in the evening, they were all cheered. You know, he clearly thinks he has and maybe expected more popular support and maybe some support from within the security services as well. He's not acting like somebody who's about to be pushed out of a window.
And as we've just seen in Kieran's piece, Wagner is a sort of, global enterprise, gold mines here, a few diamonds there, taking part, crucial part in the war in Syria. What happens to Wagner Inc., Wagner Global Inc. now?
That I can't answer. I mean, there are many things that are unexplained after this weekend, and that's one of them. They've removed their troops from Ukraine. It seems the regular army is going to continue from here. But what happens to the rest of it, I don't know. I mean, remember, a lot of this is a money-making operation. Prigozhin made a lot of that money, but you have to presume that some of the money was going to other people in Moscow. Whoever that is, whether it's Putin himself or others around him, isn't going to want it to come to a rapid end.
I mean, in a sense, we've all been reduced to ringside observers in this extraordinary drama. What does this now mean for NATO? What does it mean for Europe? What does it mean for the United States?
I mean, it was interesting. The number of boring statements that came out of Western capitals over the weekend was very funny. Everybody was consulting with their allies and observing the situation and so on. I mean, nobody really had anything very interesting to say. I mean, there was a moment. I mean, had there really been a slide into the civil war that Putin himself was talking about on Saturday morning, had that begun to happen, then there could have been really quite dramatic implications for the war in Ukraine, because troops would have had to come home from Ukraine in order to protect Moscow, and so that didn't happen, and so we haven't had a big shift in the war effort yet. I mean, I think over the longer term, it's an indication that Russia is not really going back to becoming a stable partner anytime soon. And in fact, the level of instability may grow, and it may take forms we haven't even thought of yet.
And I mean, you mentioned the bland statements from foreign leaders over the weekend at these rather unbland, dramatic events in Moscow. I mean, equally, many people were predicting that this is the end of Putin. Do you still think that?
I didn't think that, and I think it's premature to think that. I mean, we are clearly at some kind of turning point. So there hasn't been this kind of public demonstration of his weakness or of his system's weakness before in this dramatic way. I think it's much too early to start counting him out.
And should we be afraid of what happens after Putin more than worrying about Putin in power right now?
I dislike that way of thinking because, it first of all fences off the option that there might be an improvement. Second of all, it underrates the degree to which Putin is, really one of the worst possible leaders of Russia that we could have. I mean, he's conducting a genocidal war. He's trying to undermine democracies and all over the world. Through the Wagner Group and others, he's seeking to, destabilize regimes in Africa and the Middle East. I mean, it's really hard to think of anybody who could be a lot worse than that.
Okay, so there is a positive and plausibly positive scenario that we shouldn't be discounting.
Of course, there are positive scenarios. The change of power in Russia would create a moment of opportunity. I mean, it could go well or it could go badly, but it would be an opportunity to get rid of the most dangerous leader of Russia that we've had in a generation.
Anne Applebaum, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.